The fire that overtook the Jasper townsite late last month left many Canadians reeling. Like Fort McMurray and Slave Lake before it, the wildfire hit the iconic mountain destination, destroying a large swath of the community. I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is 10-3. Edmonton Journal reporter Zac Delaney joins me to discuss the destruction wrought by the fire, the recovery efforts, and how long residents could be waiting before they return. Don't forget you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So, Zach, by now, people across Canada have heard about the wildfire that has taken over Jasper National Park and encroached on the townsite of Jasper, a place that many Canadians know and love. Walking us back to last week, when did the fire first break out? And when did it get big enough that officials there thought, we need to start getting people out?
Yeah, it was happening very quickly, and it all kind of kicked off around Monday. So that would be July 22nd at that point. And Parks Canada, one of the first notices we see if we go back through at this point is around 9:30 p.m. on Monday night. They issued a release saying they were investigating some fires that had started at that time, and they had put the entire municipality of Jasper on a notice of evacuation, but they weren't carrying it out yet. They didn't feel like it was needed at that time. Within a very short period of time after that, they did release a secondary notice through Facebook and some other channels saying that they were putting the entire municipality of Jasper on evacuation order. And that started around 10:30 it was on Monday night. And at that time, the messaging that they had said was that the fire was within 5 hours of reaching the town, which is where there starts to be a bit of confusion as to when it was getting close to town and when it was actually going to reach the town site. That first messaging said 5 hours, but it didn't actually end up reaching the town until about a day later from that. So it was a bit of a discrepancy at that time, but in that span of time, directly after their initial notice at about, it was 10:40 actually, they ended up getting the entire town evacuated, and they were in the process of getting all of the backcountry campers and hikers out of the area as well. So everyone was out by the time it hit the town, which ended up being Wednesday night.
Yeah, and I mean, it was pretty chaotic through late Tuesday into Wednesday, as there started to be fear that the fire itself would hit the town. What was driving the fire in the direction it was? Because I believe initially the fire that came from the south and into the town was the one that was further away. What did officials have to say about it? When did they realize, oh my gosh, it's gonna break into the town itself?
Yeah, I think this was always a concern that they had, but I think that the wind that occurred kind of Tuesday evening and all throughout the day on Wednesday was so strong that it pushed that fire at such a rapid pace that it became very clear that this thing that they were fearing, that it could potentially come to town, which is why they had brought everybody out of the town. It was very clear at that point that this was inevitable, which is why by Wednesday evening, they actually didn't have there was certainly no residents or civilians in town, but they actually started evacuating all of the emergency personnel who didn't have their own sort of self-contained breathing apparatus, because the smoke had gotten so bad at that point. So the wind is really what drove everything at that time, and they knew that was happening kind of throughout the late night on Tuesday and throughout the day on Wednesday.
Mm-hmm. And like, we're talking about the winds driving this fire. I remember there was an official, and I can't remember if it was a Parks Canada official or someone involved in the wildfire fight, that was describing the behavior of the fire. What were they talking about when it came to the fire itself?
Honestly, fire in general, whenever people describe it, it's always a bit dramatic. And this one is absolutely no different. These are complete veterans with wildfire, but the descriptions that they're kind of giving for this particular fire are pretty extreme. They're talking about there's 150-kilometer winds. They describe them as feeling like hurricane level winds. That's driving it. We spoke to the fire chief and one of the incident commanders who was in town at the time when it started to hit. And before the fire had even actually touched the town, they started to have what's called an ember shower. And this happens with a lot of different wildfires. Essentially just means that wherever the fire itself is happening, roughly, a kilometer off in the distance, there could be embers and some flaming debris coming down. And so they were describing this as, pine cones and things like that. So these pine cones and these bits of flaming debris started raining down on the town on Wednesday night. And at that point, they started to mobilize, their fire crews and whatnot. But when they could actually see the flames and when it was moving through a forested section, the description that we've heard a few times is about 300 meters, which is kind of impossible to imagine. It's like a tidal wave of fire just coming towards the town. And they were just essentially, the description that they've had once it was coming towards the town was that at that point, they just started mobilizing and working on the structures. They didn't stop, obviously, to look up at the fire. It was just, okay, we see this. We've got these embers that are creating hot spots around the community. So at that point, that's kind of when the descriptions of the fire stop. We heard high winds, raining embers, and then we heard extremely tall flames that were coming way up above 100 meters above the tree line.
Now, you spent a number of days in Hinton, which was the staging area for first responders. Some evacuees wound up there. How would you describe the mood on the ground there? And what, obviously Hinton, for those who don't know, is a bit of a drive away from Jasper. It's not super far, but it's not exactly close. So you are a little ways away. But what did you see on the ground when you were in Hinton?
It was a kind of a rolling change. My colleague and I, Greg, arrived there sometime around Tuesday afternoon. And it was really strange coming from Edmonton to get there on Tuesday afternoon, because by that point, there was actually less smoke in Hinton than there was in Edmonton when we had left. It was pretty clear skies, and it was a relatively normal day. The only thing that was sticking out to us at that time was the first person that we spoke to on the ground, who ended up being an evacuee of Jasper. He was a young man who had to come out of the Jasper Park Lodge, and we spotted him because he was brushing his teeth in a McDonald's parking lot. So we asked him about, what he'd been doing that night. That was kind of the first indication. Most of the community felt relatively normal. There was not a ton of smoke. That kind of stayed that way throughout Tuesday. And then we went on what was supposed to be a media tour into the town of Jasper. And when we departed from the park gate, which is, I'm estimating here, but I would say it's about a half an hour from the park gate into the town of Jasper, we left there and we were going to be escorted in by RCMP, and the agreement was that we were going to go all the way in. And in the span of 15 minutes on the drive in, as we're being escorted by them, the entire sort of convoy of ourselves and other media and the RCMP just sort of abruptly pulled over, and we were on Highway 16, and we could see the tops of flames, and we could see some smoke on the hillside on sort of our right side, which was actually the North Fire at that point. And RCMP said, you know what, the fire has gotten too unpredictable at this point. We can't go in. That was one of our first sort of indications that this was starting to get worse. And the wind was already high at that time. So we were stopped on this media tour, and we had to go back to Hinton at that time. We wake up the next morning on Wednesday, and there's more smoke in town. It's noticeable, but we're not seeing any more emergency personnel. The community doesn't seem to be any more active in Hinton than it was the day before. It's just kind of visibly there is more smoke, and there's certainly a lot of wind at that point. And the first thing that my colleague and I that morning did was speak to a couple of helicopter pilots who had been sort of requested to be helping out with the fire, and they were doing bucket runs and dropping water on the fire to try and help kind of contain it at that point. So their plan at 9 a.m. was to go and do that all day. And that was sort of the last that we heard of them. And then by 6 p.m., this is kind of when we know everything started to change in Hinton at that point. That is when more smoke rolled in. That is when the sky started to kind of blacken from the excess of smoke coming from the fires. And later, towards 7 p.m., we started to see ash coming down, and it was a mixture of ash and rain at that time. So it was sticking to cars. It was very sort of apocalyptic at that point. And that is when the feeling in the community really shifted at that point. And I could feel it because we were sitting and having some supper, and even our own, wait staff and the cooks from the kitchen that we were at went outside, and they were just sort of standing there and looking towards the west and looking at where the smoke is coming from, and watching this just constant run of fire trucks just going towards the town of Jasper. And that was sort of the last thing we saw on Wednesday night. And by Thursday morning, the tone had completely shifted from this very apprehensive sort of feeling to just waiting. I think everybody was waiting to see what the damage was at that time. And as we all know from social media and everything, that is roughly when the videos, the photos started to roll through of the damage in the community. And I think everybody took a somber moment on Thursday morning as those started to roll in for the damage that had been done overnight.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, these images started rolling out through various sources on social media. The Moline Lodge in flames, the destruction in the town, complete blocks razed by flames. As we go from that feeling, a kind of mourning that started to sink in, because as mentioned off the top, a lot of people have a strong connection or strong ties or a great affection for Jasper National Park and the townsite itself. We go into Friday, and on Friday, the Premier Danielle Smith, some of her ministers, as well as Federal Minister Harjit Sajjan, they met with Jasper Mayor Ireland. They did a bit of a tour of a stationing point in Hinton, and then toured the town. I know they did a press conference in Hinton before they headed into the town. What was the messaging from the group before they headed into Jasper? And then what did they say to media in kind of almost a hastily called press conference late Friday afternoon after the tour of the town?
After their initial tour of the command center, they went to sort of a wildfire training center in Hinton where wildfire fighters are trained for Alberta. And when they were talking at that stage prior to touring the town of Jasper, there was a tone of positivity. And I think that everybody really picked up on that. That we talked heavily about 70% of the community was saved, and all major and critical infrastructure had been saved. Talking hospitals and schools and that kind of thing. They were all okay. Even Minister Sajjan praised the evac of the community and the fire smarting efforts that had been done to sort of preserve it, which is what they credited for allowing them to preserve 70% of the community in the face of this wildfire. So he actually said, somebody asked him, what are the takeaways from the federal government in looking at this fire and the damage that it caused? And he said, what the message that we're going to take away from this is that we need to bring this everywhere, because these people who fought on the ground and were battling the fire all night, had it not been for the efforts that had been made to fire smart the community ahead of the fire, we would not be talking about this kind of positive, result with so much of the community saved. But the last person to kind of speak that at that press conference before heading into the town was the mayor of Jasper, Richard Ireland. And one of the things he had said was, I need to go and do this because I need to be able to see this for my community and offer them and prepare them for what is about to be an extremely tough time. And I have to prepare myself because my own house was on the west end of town, which we know was one of the places that was hit hardest overnight. And at that time, I think it started to kind of sink in for other folks that, yes, there's a level of positivity to this, but that doesn't negate what is still an incredible amount of damage. But ultimately, that was sort of the final message from everybody who spoke before going in was, you know what? This could have been a lot worse. So then later in the day on Friday, they had come out from their tour of the town of Jasper. And as you mentioned, it was sort of a hastily sort of gathered press conference. It was quite literally on the side of the highway, right at the blockade where nobody else could go further west and into the Jasper National Park. And the messaging had certainly shifted. The conversation around losses of percentages, it seemed to sort of wane. And I like to read a quote from Mayor Ireland, which it really just summed up exactly what the mood was at that time. He said, at the community level, 30% being something, as the Premier said earlier, that means 70% remains. And that's important because we have 70% to rebuild from. But at an individual level, that is meaningless. If it was 1%, it would still be a dozen homes, that is, that would have been destroyed. And he continued, I can understand that in a way that I thought I could before, but I understand it better now because I am among them. So myself and the group of media that were gathered around, as I said, we're on the side of a highway. And at that, even despite standing on the side of a very busy roadway, you could hear a pin drop at that time. I think that really undercut this level of positivity that had been discussed before. It's not to negate the efforts of firefighters and the fact that 70% is still a lot to build from. It's just, it made it really clear to everybody that for a whole portion of this town, that's not going to mean anything because they may have just lost their homes or their businesses, their livelihood in some fashion.
We'll be right back. What is the feeling among town residents about the response to the fire and the concern for the community and when they may get back? Like, I know this has kind of been work that's being done, not just by you, but other colleagues of yours in the newsroom. How are residents feeling at this point?
I think I do believe that it depends on the resident you ask, but I would probably hazard to say that a large portion of the respondents that we have kind of spoken to, they didn't have a lot of criticisms or any per se about the way that the evacuation was handled or fighting the fire itself was handled. But there were some concerns and some criticisms about the amount of information that they were getting. And one example of this was a gentleman that I encountered at breakfast one morning on Thursday morning. He was from Jasper. He had been evacuated with his family. And at that time, he just had no idea whether his home was affected. He had no idea when he was going to be able to find out. He had no clue as to when the community was going to be able to get back in and see what the damage was like. So those lingering questions about the after effect and trying to clarify who this has impacted, I've heard some criticisms about that. But the residents from the town that I have spoken to haven't been critical of how the actual threat of the wildfire was handled itself.
Amongst all this, because we are talking about a national park, the way that it's managed is slightly different. And there's been a lot of discussion around wildfire management in Jasper and whether the federal government or Parks Canada did enough to mitigate the risk in Jasper specifically. I know there have been reports that have come out in recent days that talk about how it was recommended that more controlled burns be done, that there were concerns about trees that were ravaged by the pine beetle, creating fuel potentially for this fire. And I understand we're, relatively speaking, we're still in early days, and I imagine that this is going to be studied at length. But in the immediacy, what did Mayor Ireland have to say in response to that discussion?
Yeah, he actually addressed that at the late sort of Friday evening press conference that was, discussed on the side of the highway just after they had left the town of Jasper. So he had just seen his own home was destroyed in this wreckage, and I think he spoke very passionately about the fact that there was no ill intent, there was no ill will, and he authoritatively stated that he felt confident that were it not for the efforts that had been done, there would have been far more damage to the community. That is to say that there would be any community left at all. So, he was praising the amount of work that had been done. He had no criticisms about the efforts to mitigate wildfire in advance. He had no criticisms as to how they handled it at the time of the fire. He actually strongly advocated that this was not the time to kind of raise those criticisms. He basically said this was nature doing what nature does. And he said there's no need to try to explain this.
Mm-hmm. Back to residents. I know they're very much in a waiting game right now. There's the question of cleanup. There's the question of even just being allowed into the town to see homes that have been destroyed or take stock of homes that are still standing, but, either have had no power for weeks. Maybe you have spoiled food in refrigerators. Maybe you have water damage. Maybe there's minor smoke damage from the fire itself. Do we know when residents may be able to return to see the community? And for those who haven't lost their homes, when they may be able to return home? And for those who lost homes and businesses, do we have an idea on a timeline for even thinking about rebuilding?
Unfortunately, the answer to both of those things is no. So there is no timeline for when the residents are going to be able to re-enter, though there has been a lot of discussion around what re-entry will look like. They're talking about a sort of a phased re-entry, so not necessarily allowing everybody to move in at one time, but perhaps being able to take tours of the community or to be able to allow people who are in areas that were less affected or not affected by the fire to be able to get back to those areas. But as of right now, none of those plans have been finalized or formalized in any way. Similarly, there are no timelines for rebuilding at the moment. The provincial government has talked about it. Premier Smith spoke recently, as of today on Wednesday, July 31st. There's been news that they are looking to fast track the permitting that would be allowed for the rebuilding phase, and there's been some sort of senior members of her cabinet and of the UCP government to work together with Parks Canada to be able to expedite that process. She said, we don't want to be 3 or 4 years in and still waiting for development and permit approval. So there is some stated intent to expedite it, to be as fast as possible. But in terms of a timeline, there just isn't any at this time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know it's a story that Canadians across the country have been paying attention to and will continue to follow as we get more developments. Zac, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Dave.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Zac Delaney. More from him and more wildfire coverage at edmontonjournal.com. I'm Dave Breakenridge. Thanks for listening.